So this evening we are getting back to our study of Let the Men Be Men. If you haven't had an opportunity to grab one of these books that we're working our way through, I believe we got another half dozen copies in. They should be out there in the foyer. You can go and grab one, and if not, if you've got one maybe at home or something like that, and you didn't bring it this week, that's all right. We're going to be reading through it this evening a good bit. Tonight, I'm just going to go ahead and give you a little bit of a heads up so that we can kind of stay on track with the ladies. We're going to be wrapping up what we didn't get last time at the end of chapter 2 and trying to make it all the way through chapter 3 this evening. And so if I'll talk fast, hopefully you'll listen fast. Or wait, no. Yeah, there we go. Listen fast and I'll talk fast and we'll be all right. But where we've been so far in the Let the Men Be Men study, a couple different things I want to recap before we dive in. And I'm doing this intentionally. As we are addressing this topic, there is no shortage of, I think, sort of cultural anecdotes that we could look at, or indicators from the world around us where we could say, man, there is a crisis of manhood. There's virtually no disagreement anywhere you would fall in looking at that and coming to that conclusion. Whether you would say, yeah, the crisis is manhood, or whether you would say, yeah, there is a crisis of manhood, that men don't know who they are, what they're supposed to be. I think across the board, everyone within our society would say, something's gone wrong. As to what we do in response to that, to say, all right, well, here's how we find the solution. Here's what the solution is. Here's where right is. We need to have an objective authority. We need to have not just, hey, what does society at large say? Because in 5 years or 5 minutes, that will not work and that will not be acceptable. Beyond that, if we say, hey, let's just ask the specialists, the gurus, the experts, they don't agree with one another. So we know that that cannot be accurate. And so what we always must do, and we're going to hear more about this on the Lord's Day as we continue through the 5 non-negotiables, what we always must do is come back to what is an objective outside of ourselves and authoritative, meaning coming from above us, standard for manhood. If we're going to say, hey, there's a problem, and we're going to look for a solution, that solution must be found outside of us, because we're the problem, and it must come from above us, because, again, we don't have the faculties to say, and here's how we fix it. We've got to have something outside and above us that's authoritative, that's dictating this is how we arrive at right. And as believers in particular, we cannot settle for some substitute that's not actually biblical. We can't say, well, you know, this guy, he talks about a lot of good masculine things and recovering manhood. He just doesn't get into the gospel, or he's not a believer, but he says a lot of good things. We cannot settle for that, man. We cannot settle for, well, you know, I mean, I just want to be a faithful husband, hard worker, having good ethics. That's not enough. And even as we strive to encourage others, one of the things that we're going to get into this evening, even as we strive to encourage others towards these things, we cannot move away from the foundation of, apart from the gospel, and in particular, apart from what is a result or a fruit of the gospel taking root in the heart of an individual, the Spirit of God working and empowering and strengthening and providing grace to obey, apart from that, these things cannot be accomplished. We can get cheap substitutes, and they'll fail, and they'll falter, and they'll crack, and we will not make real men. We have to begin in these places. And by the way, each of these areas in which we're considering these things, these facets of manhood, these categories of what is genuine manhood, in all of them, we don't get to skip the steps or say, well, I don't like that one as much, or that one's too hard, and so I'm not going to. They're all integrally connected. But we don't get to say, well, you know, that chapter that we're in this evening on biblical headship, let the men be leaders, man, that's tough, that's hard. And in particular, in this arena that's first laid out for us, this foundational arena of the home, we don't get to say, I'll be a leader somewhere else, but not there. It will not work. And even as the next chapter is going to highlight for us, we have to be men of integrity. that are not just saying, hey, yeah, men need to do this, just not me. Men need to be doing these things, just men collectively, but individually, not so much. Not very long ago, Pastor Philip taught on a Wednesday night, one of the missing ingredients that we see in so much of society, but even within the church and within individual lives, is the idea of integrity. The idea of being whole, consistent. If we say, yeah, I see this problem, I see the crisis of manhood, I see the crisis of what does it mean to be a man, but I don't want to do these things, we will not come to a different solution. We can't improve on the plan of God, on the design of God. God's design isn't just good. It's not just better. It's exclusively right. And our fallen nature is so often contented with good enough, right? We're so often contented with, look, we live, even as we've been learning in our theology of work, we live in a fallen world. There's brokenness everywhere. That doesn't mean that we don't aim for obedience. That doesn't mean where we try to essentially carve out a caveat for ourselves where we say, look, everybody fails, everybody sins, everybody struggles, nobody's perfect, and so as a result, we don't strive for obedience. Man, one of the things that is so essential in our walk as believers is that we keep really forefront in our mind, one day we will stand and give an account. One day we will stand before the Lord, and there will be a give an account of your stewardship. Man, do we live with that? When we wake up, do we begin our day with that reminder? Because, by the way, that naturally drifts away from us. Do we begin our day with that reminder of, I'm going to give an account for today? In our interaction with our children, with our spouse, with those around us, I'm going to give an account one day. As we settle into bed at night, do we lay ourselves down with the thought of, and how will today be accounted? I mean, that's labor. And some days that's going to be a very discouraging accounting. And by the grace of the Lord, we continue on. And there's a part of us that might say, oh, look, I would go crazy if I did that. But again, I'm really simple. Consider the alternative. Consider the alternative to that. The alternative would be, I'm going to go through life recklessly with no thought of, and one day I will give an account. I'm just going to go through as if these are my goods, and this is just here for my pleasure. And all of these things, all of the things that I've been entrusted in my stewardship, my time, my resources, all of those things, myself, my family, all of that's just to be expended upon me. The Lord Jesus gives us a picture of what that looks like. That's a servant that gets cast out into outer darkness. That's the servant that forgets that one day the master will return and begins to get drunk and beat his fellow slaves. And when the master shows up, says, you are a worthless servant, depart from me. Man, it is far too easy to not take our stewardship seriously. But here's the gracious and good news is that the Lord has provided his word to say, and this is how you walk. Because we cannot hear, I'm going to give an accounting one day and then think, all right, I got to really scramble to figure out what I'm going to do. No. We got to scramble to take heed to what has been given. And then in the empowering of the Spirit, remember we talked about being dependent on. Being dependent on the Spirit of God, the grace of God, what has been provided by the Lord himself in the body. In that, we press forward. Entrusting ourselves to him who is trustworthy. That's what we do in this. And that's good news. So as we return to this chapter, and we consider these last two headings, this is on page 46 and 47 of this chapter on Let the Men Be Leaders. I want to summarize these very quickly as we get into chapter 3. This role, these functions of headship, particularly in the home, they're to be characterized, as we saw last time, among other things, being sacrificial, but also being in protection from defiling, but also sensitive and caring love. Quoting from Ephesians chapter 5, verse 28, the author lays out for us, so husbands also ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. Then he goes on to talk about, generally people take a lot of time to care for themselves. They go to great lengths to protect themselves, to care for themselves, to preserve themselves. You've probably heard it said that there's probably no greater instinct than the instinct of self-preservation. And that's what the Spirit of God, through the Apostle Paul, says, and you're to care for your spouse in this way, which, by the way, is backed up through the entire doctrine of oneness. You and your spouse are one. And there's supposed to be this sensitivity and a care for them according to their needs. Not just domestic tranquility and maintaining. But caring for them according to what do they need most. And men, there's a lot that we can say here. And again, I'm trying to summarize as we move through this. And I would encourage you, read it carefully. If you've got questions about these things that we're going to kind of run through this evening, see us afterwards. But what do they need most? It's not us. And that's a humbling thing. What they need most is Christ. The statement is made in this chapter that our marriage ought to be permeated by the Word of God. Men, are we the kind of men that are able to be a resource for God and godliness to our spouse, to those entrusted to our care? Are we those who can minister God's word accurately, God's word to their great needs? Going on from there on page 47, the author is going to say this. How does a man live out this kind of sensitive and caring love? 1 Peter 3:7 provides great insight. You husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with a weaker vessel, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. The man committed to demonstrating this type of love will show great consideration. He will live with her, quote, in an understanding way. That's a deep, intimate knowledge. A specialized knowledge, which means to treat her the way that Jesus Christ would. He will feel what she feels, talk when she needs it, and listen even when he does not think he has enough time. Godly men move beyond trying to fix their wives' problems to understanding, listening, and sacrificing to meet their spouse's needs. Now listen, that does not mean that we're not engaged in that. So much of worldly wisdom says, just listen, don't try to fix. Now we need to listen and not just try to fix. And we need to try to fix. But here's the deal. We're not providing the solutions. What we're doing is we're directing towards, and here's God's solution. What this chapter said earlier of, it's not just here, honey, this is what you need to do. We come back to, here, honey, this is what God's word says we must do. Here's where we need to labor in these things according to what God has said in his word. Not just, hey, I think this is how we ought to do this. He goes on and says this is to be characterized on the next page as by an unbreakable and eternal love. He goes on and talks about, towards the bottom of this page, page 48, divorce for adultery and desertion is biblically permissible, but ultimately God's desire is for the marriage bond to be permanent. Marriage is such a temporary commodity today. It's such a, throwaway, cast off, easily dissolved thing that it has lost so much of its weight and commitment, so much of its value. And of all people, believers ought to be those who are striving most for its preservation, and it's being held, as we learned and were reminded of in Hebrews chapter 13, held in honor. Because again, so often we can sort of shrug this off on the society, on the Supreme Court. Let's be clear, it's not the Supreme Court's ultimate job to define, protect, sanction marriage. Believers have this responsibility of upholding and demonstrating and manifesting, here is God's design. Further on from there, on the next page, joyous and intimate love. He goes on, and I love this. I wanted to read so much more of this. I'm going to read a big chunk of it on the middle of page 49. Oh, we'll just start right there at the top. 1 Corinthians 7:4 says to the Christian husband that his body is not his own, but instead belongs to his wife. Proverbs 5:15 through 19 says the husband is to be exhilarated, captivated, consumed, and impassioned with the love of his wife. Once a man is married, his wife should become the standard of beauty for him. The culture should no longer define what beauty is for a Christian husband. He should be able to say honestly from his heart that there is no comparison to his wife's beauty because she is the one God made especially for him. Married men ought to determine in their hearts their wives, the ideal woman, their personal standard of feminine beauty. The one flesh relationship a husband experiences with his wife should be so complete that sexual intimacy with her is not only exhilarating, but the greatest way they can be they both can express the depth of their love for each other in Christ. Man, this is, again, one of the chief ways in which marriage can be held in high esteem. Where our wives occupy a singular place of devotion and affection and beauty. Because at the end of the day, that other one with whom we would make a comparison, that's not ours. She's not yours. But the one whom you have been joined with, this one, no. This one is the one with whom you have been entrusted to care and be captivated by. Are we faithful to cultivate that? To, as Proverbs 5 would say, just have a singular devotion. You're only drinking from one well. And not to embrace the world's view of these things. Not to embrace the world's philosophy of, it doesn't really matter, listen, times have changed. All of the foolishness that comes along from the world of, look, you can get your appetite anywhere as long as you only eat at home. There's that kind of foolishness that floats around out there that is so perverse to the design of God and the goodness and the wholesomeness that is provided for by God's design. The author says this on the final page of this chapter. All of this stems from a desire to live out God's design for men. This isn't just, hey, I want to stay out of trouble. Well, I don't want to go through the hassle of. I don't want to be, I do want to have a happy marriage, happy wife, happy life. And again, all of the sort of worldly stuff that floats around there. This is not so much about, again, I used this phrase before. It's not original with me or here or anything else. You probably have heard it. This is not about just maintaining domestic tranquility. I just want to have a peaceful home. Men, and many of you who have walked this path faithfully for many years, living godly, living biblically, it's not always going to mean peacefulness in the home. But it means something in terms of, hey, everything's honky-dory, everything's fine, everything's nice and lovely. No, but it means righteousness. And it means the Lord is pleased. He has this wonderful note at the very end of the chapter. For the young single man, becoming a faithful, committed, and godly spiritual head of his wife does not happen instantly on the wedding day. Instead, it takes years of spiritual commitment through learning the word, praying, cultivating his giftedness in the church, and walking in the Spirit. It starts during the years before marriage when he is still single as he pursues the biblical qualities of manhood, which the coming chapters will unfold. two quick things to say here. Number one, I so appreciate that this is, because we have some of them here tonight. We have men in here who do not yet have the wife that the Lord has for them. And so here's the note of, well, this is what you do in the meantime. You pursue what does it mean to be a godly man now for then and for the rest of your life. But let's be clear, that pursuit doesn't really change after the I do. It doesn't change 15 years in. It doesn't change 25 years in. It looks different, but ultimately, this is the same pursuit. This is, well, learning the word, praying, cultivating giftedness in the church, and walking in the Spirit. It's just the steadiness of doing those same things year after year, growing in them. And as we're going to see in just a minute in the next chapter, one of the things that the Lord has designed the church to absolutely provide is examples of this. That there would be godly men who would say, walk where I've walked, as it aligns with God's word. And where I've stepped out of it, don't step there. I can tell you that because I did. The Lord has provided the church so that there would be a horde of men that are pressing on in godliness, and up ahead of them are others who have said, I've been down this road and come and follow me. Walk the way that I'm walking, come after me, follow me. Here we go. We're all heading in the same direction. Not, let me try to forge my own path. Let me try to figure this out as I go. One of the things we heard from one of our missionaries, it's probably been a couple of years now, is he came and reported about some of the different ways that the culture worked in the country that he was in. He was in a Central African country. And he talked about how there's a whole culture in some of the areas where they were ministering where there wasn't any kind of culture of training up the next generation. There was very much the parents, we don't want to teach the children how to do things and what to do and how to do this. And as a result, what do you think happened? What do you think? Yeah, it fell apart, but what else? You think there was any long-term progress made? No, best case scenario, you only got as far as the generation before you. There was no, hey, I've done this, see where I've been, walk in these steps and go farther than me. There was none of that communication and transmission of information. Instead, it was every generation relearns the exact same problems and makes no progress, makes no headway. And men, it does not need to be this way according to God's design. God's design is rather that there would be those who would be the godly examples, and that others would, coming behind them, say, yep, no, he's going the direction I want to go. I'm going to get in his boot prints and go that way. So that there can be the progress. There doesn't need to be. We see it happening in our world today. Everybody trying to reinvent themselves, trying to find a brand new identity. Why? Because there's not this transmission taking place. There's not this transmission of, you don't have to do it that way. And oftentimes, because the blame isn't only on one end of this, oftentimes when there is that, hey, it doesn't have to be this way, bro. You don't have to go that way. For those who are following, there's a responsibility of humility that says, I'm going to follow that. I'm going to listen to that. Because where there's a resistance to that, where there's a resistance to say, I don't want to take counsel, I don't want to heed that, I don't want to listen to that, that person is choosing a hard path. Scripture tells us that. They're characterized as the fool in places like Proverbs 18, chapter 1. The one who separates himself from all counsel. Why? Because they just want to do what they want. That person is choosing a hard path. But that's not what we see in the pages of Scripture is supposed to be, in particular, the design for the church. This is not the design that the Lord has laid out for the church. Rather, what we have in God's Word is, do this. take heed, and it's good. In particular, we see this in Titus chapter 1 and 2. This is where we're going to be primarily this evening. So if you have your Bible, you can be turning to Titus chapter 2 and verse 1. Titus chapter 1 and Titus chapter 2. This chapter in the book, the third chapter, Let the Men Be Grounded, the author in particular he's going to tell a fantastic story about a free climber who plunged to his death because he thought he was grabbing hold of something reliable, and instead was grabbing hold of a spider's web. And as a result, having entrusted himself to something unreliable, he died. And man, this is why I began this evening stressing we need something objective and authoritative. We need something reliable, because the outcome, if we entrust ourselves to something unreliable, will be destruction. In particular, as the author continues, one of the things that he talks about is, through the years, there's been sort of a ever-shifting description of what is masculinity, what does manhood look like. On page 54, this is what this is going to say. They say for centuries there have been a same secular standard right underneath the shifting culture. To be admired, a man needed to be physically strong or skilled. He needed to be productive, courageous, wise, and a soldier who battled over his possessions and rights. He needed to be a protector of his spouse, children, and anyone else who was weaker. He also needed to be the decision maker for his home, the center of his family, and the captain of his own soul. Those secular standards are changing, and I would actually say those shift through the centuries. And they also shift through cultures. Those shift all over the place, and so we can never take a secular standard and say, man, back in the day, I remember when I was very young, probably about Remy's age, so about 5. I was visiting with my grandparents, and my grandfather, who had grown up, gone through adolescence and through the Great Depression. And I was visiting with my grandfather and sitting with him out on the back porch of his house, and sort of just in the little bit that I knew of how to interact with my grandfather, asking him, Papa, tell me about the good old days. And I remember him so vividly, it's just burned in my mind, him kind of laughing and saying, well, I don't know how good they were. And then learning a little bit later as I grew up and things about the Great Depression and going, yeah, I don't know that I would have characterized those as the good old days. But we tend to act that way, right? We tend to act like at some point in time past, and we can sort of mythologize, oh yeah, no, things just used to be so much better. They were fighting different fights. But there was not a time since the garden, there was not a time where we can go back and say, yeah, you know what? Things were just really good then. After the fall, after Adam and Eve, there's not really a time that we can go back and be like, you know, that was just the perfect moment. I remember hearing a church history professor lecture one time and talk about, he says, you know, all the time, and this is a guy who lived his mental, intellectual life in the past. And he said, you know, so often people will come up and be like, man, I just really wish that I could have been born 300 years ago. And he would say, I don't. I like medicine and toilet paper. That's some really good insights. As much as we would say, man, back in yesteryear, the Lord has sovereignly ordained our time, the boundaries of our life. And while we might look and say, hey, they didn't have to fight this 15 years ago, 50 years ago, there wasn't a time of, man, it was just perfect then. The fights were there. They were just different. Now we're seeing them shift radically. We're seeing things speed up in terms of, man, this is ugly. The author continues there at the top of page 55. As a result of a major cultural shift in cowardly pulpits that fail to confront it, men are often torn between more traditional expectations and some new ones that are very different. The list of desirable traits for a man is now topped by characteristics like social consciousness, flexibility, tolerance, likability, and some have even suggested femininity. How about that? One of the desired characteristics of masculinity is femininity. And this is the brokenness, by the way, that sin produces. This is not, these people, This political party, this agenda. No, sin. And he lays this at the feet of exactly where it ought to be. Changing cultural norms, cowardly pulpits. Those who are to be the pillar of the truth failing to do that. And we recognize, man, this is under the design of the Lord. This is according to what ultimately he is doing. However, there is an accounting. And we must look at, how do we get here? How do we get to the place where one of the chief characteristics that men are expected to be is, kind of feminine? Because truth is not upheld. That's a result of that distortion, that confusion, that's a result of truth is not upheld. Which is disobedience to the work of believers. We're to be those who uphold the truth. Going on from there, he says, so there's some different responses that are commonplace today. There on page 55, he's going to say there's all these cultural demands that many have opted for less than best solutions. He says there's the irresponsible man. This man keeps his own agenda. He does not want to be tied down with too many commitments. Responsibilities like finances, disciplining children, involvement in church, house repairs, or keeping promises to friends are seen as an irritation and a hindrance to his own personal happiness. I don't want to do those things. Like that's going to take up my time. And by the way, this is a mark of childishness too. It's remarkable teaching in the school when people talk about, I don't want to take a job like that. I don't want to get a job, especially I teach upper high school students. I don't want to get a job like that. Why? I just don't have the time. Well, why? I have other things that I want to do. I want to have fun. The problem is when that continues on uninterrupted into adulthood, or what ought to be adulthood, where it's I want to do fun things, not the things that I must do. Another option that's less than best is the negative man. This man is strongly opinionated and dogmatic. He frowns more than he smiles, and his speech is full of warnings, rules, routines, and rigid orderliness. Next, there's the distant man. This type of man may very often be very often in the presence of his family, but his thoughts are constantly somewhere else. He may be bright and in great demand, but an invisible and often impregnable wall separates such a preoccupied man from his family who wishes they could break through with it. Another type of man is the complacent man, who ends up being absent, passive, or indifferent in his role as a husband and father. Last is the Peter Pan man who refuses to grow up. This is the 20 to 30-year-old who lives with his parents, spends most of his time playing video games while he waits to get offered a bank presidency job, a position for which he is not qualified. And let's be clear, I mentioned that first one, but all of these, they have the tone, they have the ring of childishness. This is one who has never embraced maturity, never embraced responsibility. But this one in particular, this is what we see so often, right? I just want to have fun, and I don't understand why people don't want to take me seriously. This is what we see so often, but do we know biblically what the alternative looks like? We can be very good at spotting the problem. We can be very good at identifying, I know that's broken. Okay, well, how do we fix it? I don't know. But again, when we come to the authoritative word, we're given the solution. The author points us directly to Titus chapter 1. The beginning of Titus is a great place to start building an understanding of God's design for both young men and young women. But Titus 2 in particular provides a helpful framework for discussing the most important biblical issues for young men and women because it addresses what they should be now and what they should hope to be in the future. In order to understand Titus 2, it is important to understand the foundation that's laid in Titus 1. He goes on and he essentially says, the first thing that's necessary, there needs to be a solid foundation, and that foundation, as he's going to lay it out, beginning on page 58, that's a spiritual foundation. That's a spiritual foundation that has to be laid. Well, what is that spiritual foundation supposed to be? First of all, it's the gospel, which is, again, where we began this entire thing in the first place. Week 1, and let the men be men. What did we do? We went through what is the gospel. Because apart from a man being born again, he cannot be the kind of man that is pleasing to God. And until we get that, until we see that as the highest priority, everything in our life, everything in our parenting, everything in our friendships, it will all be fruitless. And we need to really embrace that. As much as we might have friends, coworkers that are like, man, I just wish they would grow up. What do they need? Christ. I just want my son to be a godly, I just want my son to be a good man, a responsible man. I want him to grow into, what does he need? Prioritize the gospel. In my own life, I see failings, I see struggles, I see brokenness. What do I need? Have I embraced the gospel? I need to be examined under that, because apart from that, nothing else we set on top of it. It's a broken, wobbly foundation. Anything we put on it is only going to be more endangered because it's an untrustworthy, unreliable foundation. We have to come back to these spiritual roots. On page 58, the author's going to bring us there, Foundations for Spiritual Health. You'll see that heading there towards the bottom of the page. Paul's words to Titus in chapter 1 contain two key truths that must be understood and practiced before you can even begin to fulfill the roles God has described in Titus 2. First, in Titus 1:1, we learn that a man must be genuinely saved before he can grow to be God's man. Here Paul describes believers by referring to the faith of God's elect and the full knowledge of the truth which is according to godliness. This description is radically different from what is often heard in society and taught in far too few pulpits. The words, quote, God's elect, remind us of the truth that the entire human race is so utterly sinful that we are hopeless and helpless to do anything to save ourselves. He goes on and says this, therefore we are totally dependent on the mercy of God for our salvation and must trust completely in Christ by the power of the Holy Spirit. Men, again, this is where we so often settle for a less than. We are willing, like we heard this past Sunday, we can have people very easily come to the place where they're saying, yeah, look, I know that I've got problems. I know that I sin. I know that I make mistakes. I know that, look, nobody's perfect. We can get there quick. But it takes the Spirit of God working within the heart of a man to produce a born-again man. That is not something that we're able to accomplish ourselves, which then it has to go back to that question of, then what am I doing with my coworker and my parenting and all the different things in my own life? We're crying out to the one who can make the change. We are praying. We are striving after the Lord. We are crying after the Lord. Do the work that only you can do. This is that dependency that we were talking about, where we recognize, no, the situation is not just really bad, it's hopeless apart from the Lord working. That's the foundation of the gospel. The author's going to say this on the next page, referring richly into Scripture. God must save you. You can't save yourself. Jesus Christ accomplished your salvation through his perfect sinless life, his substitutionary death on the cross for your sin, and his resurrection from the dead. Your sin has fallen on Christ, and for you to be justified, his righteousness must cover you. If we had 1,000,000 lifetimes, we could not produce enough righteousness to cover our unrighteousness. Because all of our righteousness apart from Christ is as filthy rags. It's utterly detestable in his sight. Christ doesn't just give us a boost. He doesn't just help us out. He doesn't just provide a good example. Christ is all in all. And until we or any other man or woman comes to that place, because by the way, they don't come to that place on their own. They come to that only by the work of the Spirit of God. Until they come to that place, doesn't matter how hard they work, what good ethics they have, that's nice trappings on a burning building. Man, it has to have a spiritual foundation. And it has to be a foundation that looks at Christ and says, I'm dependent on him and him alone. Going on from there, he says that this is going to be followed by growing in knowledge. At the bottom of page 59, the author is going to say this: being a born-again Christian does not merely mean professing Christ, but also living a uniquely different life from those who do not know him. You don't work to earn salvation, but once you are saved, you will be known for good works. Why? Because God has given you a new heart that desires to obey God's word. In the next paragraph, he's going to say this: true salvation results in a heart that desires to obey God's word. Man, this is one of the easiest areas to examine. Do we have this? Do we want to obey God's word? For those of you that have professing family, coworkers, friends, where you would say, yeah, you know, they say that they're a believer, and I don't know what to say to them. Take them to God's word. Hold up the mirror. This is what God's word says. Well, what separates you from the unbeliever? Well, like we heard this past Sunday, one of the things that is just a proof positive, do they have a high view of God? Do they have a high view of God? Or do they have the soda machine version of God? Do they have the genie, the cosmic concierge view of God? You know, he's just there to help me out whenever I need him. That's such a low and degraded view of God. But we have that as a starting place. Do we want to know the Lord? The author continues in that second paragraph on page 60. When you are genuinely born again, you're regenerated. God has transformed your inner man. All of it is a part of God's work in saving you, and you must realize you do not choose God and you cannot save yourself, nor can you overcome your sinfulness by your own ability. No, you must cry out to God and open your heart so that you can respond to Christ by turning from your sinfulness and repentance and depending on the work of Christ by faith. And that's the beginning. That's a beginning, because right after this, very next thing the author is going to point us towards, second foundational truth, Titus 1, is that you must be interconnected in a local church before you can grow to be God's man. So there needs to be this desire of, I want to grow to be godly. I want to grow in godliness, because that's not a natural desire. It's so startling how often, again, we can settle for, I just want to be a good man. Oh man, that's such a great sign. I think this person's really on the right track. How many... There are some, but how many people do you know that when you genuinely ask them, do you want to be a bad person? Are they going to be like, yeah, absolutely. That's what I want to be. No, everybody wants to be good as long as they set the standard for good. But as soon as we pull back and say, no, he's the standard for good, only someone who's been given a new heart by the grace of God says, I want to be that good. I want to be that good, and I know I can't. So I'm looking to him to perfect me, to bring me to glory, to bring me into that one day, because I know in this life I'm going to be fighting and striving and struggling against sin. That's not a natural desire. When that desire is in place, the only way, one more time, the only way that's going to be accomplished according to God's design is through that person being interconnected, to borrow the author's word, in the local church. Are you saying you got to be a part of the church to be a Christian? I'm saying I don't know how you are without it. For someone who says, no, I'm a strong and growing believer, which, by the way, are hallmarks of those who are believers, growing. To be a growing believer, how do you do that apart from the rest of the body? How do you do that? Better yet, why? Why would you? Because I would venture to say whatever you would fill in with well, here's why. I would say you could probably place somewhere near that, if not directly over it, idolatry. Well, because, we don't want to be tied down to one place. So you don't want commitment, you don't want accountability. You have something else that you value more than growth and obedience to the Lord. Why? Why do we need the body? The author's going to point at least to one example to begin with. All believers need spiritual examples to follow. And by God's design, every Christian needs a community to mature with in order to be more like Christ. Titus 1, 5-9 highlights all those ingredients necessary for a young man's growth and for a church's spiritual health. Believers gathered under a qualified and functioning team of elders. And again, there's this particular emphasis here in this section. I'm going to read through those verses in just a second, but I do want to point this out. There's this particular highlight on the younger men. Younger men need these things. All men need these things. And I would ask, for you in here who are the older men, are you setting this kind of example? Is this the pathway that's being highlighted, marked, blazed, so that others can come behind and clearly see, no, that's it. That's the way I'm going. Titus in chapter 1, verse 5 is going to say this. For this reason, Paul writing to Titus, I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you, namely, if any man is beyond reproach, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, who are not accused of dissipation or rebellious. For the overseer must be beyond reproach as God's steward, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, not fond of dishonest gain, but hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, righteous, holy, self-controlled, holding fast the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching, so that he will be able to both to exhort in sound doctrine and to reprove those who contradict. And before anyone says, oh, that's for the elders, and we somehow want to say, like, and we don't want to be those things? Like, which one of those do we want to pick out and say, no, I really want to be addicted to much wine. I really want to be fond of dishonest gain. Like, if we could just remove that one, I can follow after this one. Which one of those do we want to say, no, that's not a command in Scripture that I have to follow just as a Christian, not in eldering? This is the pursuit of faithful believers. And so we have to ask, what kind of pattern am I laying? And what kind of pattern am I following? The author continues this and says, and for any young man today to grow into his God-designed role, he too needs to be immersed in the ministry and community of a healthy local church made up of born-again believers under a plurality of biblical elders. He highlights the fact that the reason Paul says this to Timothy is because of the corrupt culture in which the recipients of the letter, the Cretans, the Cretan believers, looking at how their society was, he says, this is what these people need. And our society is no different. Our situation is no different to where we'd say, yeah, well, I mean, we don't live there, but so I don't need those things. All of God's word is profitable. This is essential for us. The author says this at the bottom of page 61. I'm going to pick up the pace from here. Every young man is to live in community, seeking to fulfill the New Testament one another's. The New Testament contains about 40 such commands. Love one another, accept one another, admonish one another, be kind to one another, comfort one another, confess your sins to one another and others. While this may be foreign to many churches today, the personal relationship of Christians in the local church are to be close. The Lord expects each healthy believer to participate in intentional relationships with the purpose of growth in Christ, which describes the process of discipleship young men are to pursue with other men in the body. Men, how do we practice the one another's from a distance? How do we practice these things without gathering? How do we practice these things without knowing one another? There's not this, well, you know, I can do that vaguely without really knowing their name. No, we don't get to skip the steps. So now, in Titus chapter 2, there's going to be this, well, how do I assess how I'm doing in these things? The author's going to say that both Titus and those in the church needed a solid foundation to build upon. And Paul's going to give several indicators of whether or not a young man or any person is living a spiritually healthy life. And first, on page 63, the author's going to highlight what are you doing? He says here the contrast with false believers, but really it's what you're doing. First, spiritually healthy Christians live differently than false Christians. There's this idea of there ought to be a difference. There ought to be some marked difference between the believer and the false professor or the unbeliever. Where this confusion comes in, the author is going to go on and say this. If there's not that difference, if there's not that, hey, what's different about you and the unbeliever? And let's be clear. You can have some really moral unbelievers. So it's got to be something more than, hey, I don't do these things, but I do these things instead. It's got to be something, think about this. Think about those who are devoted to their false and pagan religion, and they are dedicated ascetics to it. They don't eat meat, they don't drink alcohol, they don't go to these things, they don't watch this, they don't participate in deeds of immorality. It's all of these things. It's got to be more than just, hey, I don't cuss, try hard. It's got to be more than that. It's got to be, are you obeying God's commands from a heart that loves him? And where the confusion arises is, well, why wouldn't somebody? And the author points to this in the middle of page 64. Maybe it's because they're not Christians to begin with. In the next paragraph, he's going to say this, towards the bottom of page 64. When the gospel of Jesus Christ invades a person's life, there will be dramatic lifestyle changes, ethical choices, and moral obligations he will want to pursue. So often we refer and take us to Matthew chapter 7. The author takes you there and quotes it in Matthew chapter 7, verses 20 through 23. And that gets to be such a wonderful examination of there will be those who stand before the Lord and say, Lord, Lord, did we not do? And his response is always, because the question comes, well, how do I know that I'm not that guy? What does Jesus say? Depart from me, who? You workers of lawlessness. You who practice lawlessness. So the question becomes, and this is what he says at the bottom of page 64, if a so-called believer continues to practice lawlessness as a way of life, he or she can make no legitimate claim to being a Christian. At the bottom of the next paragraph, he's going to say, simply put, if you're not living differently, you may be deceived and not be a Christian at all. You may not be a real believer, but a make-believer. The second person who doesn't have these dramatic changes in who they are, he's going to say towards the bottom of page 65, he has been negatively influenced by bad company. Then he's going to quote from 1 Corinthians 15, verses 33 through 34. Most of us are familiar with this, even if we didn't know it came from Scripture. 1 Corinthians 15, bad company corrupts good morals. Now, most of the time, we just think about that of yeah, be careful who your friends are. In the context of what Paul is writing, he's talking about false doctrine. He's talking about those who are denying the resurrection, and he's saying you need to be careful about with whom you're spending time. Because bad doctrine results in bad behavior. Bad company with bad doctrine will make contagious their bad behavior. He says towards the bottom of that paragraph, bad company is probably a reference of professing Christians who were not really saved. He goes on to issue the caution, the warning on the next page, page 66. The danger of relationships with so-called Christians can be far greater than spending time with those who are lost and in need of a Savior. It's the same idea that we have we know if I'm going to spend time around unbelievers, those who are professedly, admittedly, I don't believe in your Jesus. We kind of know, all right, guards up, I know where these people are. But the people that come along and, no, I'm a Christian brother. I'm just like you. There's sort of this, let me relax the guard, let me relax sort of these things. Now, not all of us, some of us have that sort of suspicious bent anywhere. We're like, what kind of Christian? But there can be this, oh, well then I can just trust what you're going to say. No, Scripture is always the evaluation. Scripture is always, are they living what it says? Next, and the third reason, he says someone might not live these things, be doing these things is they may not have godly role models. It may not have those who are living these things out in a way that they're able to say, I know what this looks like with flesh. I see it in God's word. I know that it's there, but I really, I don't know what to do with it. It's unfortunately common where there's questions that will come from members of our church who will come and say, I have family, and they say they're a believer, and I think maybe they are, but there's these areas that make me doubt, that make me wonder, and we'll say either they're a false professor, or they're just surrounded by worldliness and false professors, or maybe they're just immature. Maybe they don't have anyone teaching them. And so one of the questions become, what kind of church are they a part of? What kind of church are they a part of? Is there discipling happening there? Whenever someone tells me, hey, we're going on vacation, we're doing this, we're doing that, we've been checking out churches, we live over here for part of the season, we're checking out churches. What kind of church? Is there this happening? Is there, and we use just as shorthand for all of this, discipling. Is that taking place? What we're referring to is exactly what the author's talking about here is there godly exampling happening? Is there this model of here's how we pursue godliness so that you can walk in those steps as a normal expectation for that body? That's what you're doing next. He's going to consider this, encouraging others in the truth. This is what you're encouraging others to do. So first we looked at what you're doing. Next we're looking at what are you encouraging others to do. In Titus 2:1, another indicator that a young man is living a spiritually healthy life is that he is committed to encouraging others in the truth. Paul tells Titus to speak the things which are proper for sound doctrine. When Paul says speak, the Greek verb is not referring to teaching or preaching. Rather, it refers to ordinary conversation. Moreover, Paul uses the present tense here, which means it should be a continuous action, a lifestyle. He goes on to say Titus was to train others in such a way that would point them to God's character. At the top of the next page, the author is going to make this observation. This is why the Sunday-only crowd will never experience true spiritual health or aggressive growth. They miss out on church as God designed it, which is more than Sunday services. God never intended believers to be part of a church without intimate and consistent fellowship with people in that church community. I don't remember if it was here or somewhere else that I was reading this. But it was discussing the fact that so often that term fellowship, we unfortunately can turn it into such a casual thing. We can turn it into, oh yeah, fellowship is, just grabbing coffee before the service. More than that. Fellowship is more than just spending time with other believers, though it's not less than that. Fellowship is actually engaging in these intimate relationships of we know one another and practice the one another's. He goes on and sounds some warnings here towards the bottom of that paragraph. I'll leave you to read those on your own. Finally, he's going to mention a becoming life. This is what you're consistently doing. And when I say consistently, I don't mean habitually. What I mean is with integrity. The things that you say you love, you're consistent in what you do. He goes on and says, there are things that, this is middle of page 69, Titus exhorts them to live in such a way as is fitting for a Christ follower. Healthy Christians live in harmony with what they believe. In other words, we might profess that the Lord hates these things, and then we're entertained by them. We might profess the Lord is not pleased when and then we do those things. That's not living consistently. That's not doing what is fitting, what is proper for believers. It's unbecoming. It's something that it's out of sorts. It's out of line. It's not Christ-like. Goes on and gives some examples of this. At the bottom of page 69, he says, considering some negative examples can help us better understand the positive truth as Paul is communicating in this verse. It's not proper, Christ-like character, for instance, when a Christian teenager rebels against his or her parents. It's not proper for a Christian employee to be lazy at work. It's not proper for a Christian husband to fail to live with his wife in an understanding way, or to fail to love his wife as Christ loved the church. It's not proper for a Christian wife who knows the truth of the gospel to refuse to submit to her husband as to the Lord. He goes on and offers the warning towards the end of this section in the next page. Remember, however, that living in a proper, becoming manner does not mean a legalistic adherence to human standards of morality. Paul does not tell Titus to generate a set of rules for every Christian to obey so they will appear nice and orderly on the outside. And again, this is one of those we settle for the less than, where so often we're willing to sort of, like, I've established my own standard of acceptability. This is exactly what the Pharisees did. I can keep these laws if they mean this, but as long as they don't reach my heart. One pastor said it very well when he said, I have enough trouble obeying the 10 commandments. I don't need 11. However, we are to strive for, as the author says, rather to live in a proper, becoming manner, to live out biblical principles as an act of obedience from a spirit-transformed and spirit-empowered heart. The climax of all of this, as the author points out, is to have sound doctrine. He defines that as healthy or right doctrine. On page 72, he's going to say this: sound doctrine is right teaching that results in righteous living. Sound doctrine is correctly interpreted biblical truth that results in increasingly Christ-like behavior. So where do we get the sound doctrine from? Well, it's ministered through the local church. He goes on and talks about this, of so often there can be a laziness towards this. Let me get the microwavable version. Let me just gorge myself on sermons and podcasts and things like that, rather than, no, let's get in the book and strive to understand it and apply it. Or there can be even I'm in the book and I'm retaining a bunch and I'm just pouring a whole bunch in. I'm listening to chapters. I'm reading a whole bunch. I've got a lot of the word, but I'm not actually obeying any of it. No. Those are tendencies that he points out towards young men, but I think all of us are prone towards some of these pitfalls. Maybe even many of them. So what is the alternative? What do we do instead? Well, as we've already said, sound doctrine is healthy truth that's lived out. He makes this statement, and at some point in here, I think I've passed it on. He says some young men would rather hear hard doctrine preached from the pulpit than have someone call out their bad attitude over a cup of coffee. That's real. I'd rather sit there and go, man, amen, that was great truth, that was awesome, he really brought it, than actually have someone come and do heart surgery and say, how's that going this week in that area? But man, that's sound doctrine. That's right teaching lived out. And that's the foundation for godly manhood. He says this, and we'll conclude with this, bottom of page 73. Let the word be your guide. Read the word, meditate on the word, memorize the word, listen to the word, learn to study the word, cultivate in your heart a love for truth, and saturate your mind with it. Then in dependence on the Holy Spirit, seek to be a doer of the word in every way. Men, we cannot get around the foundation of being godly men. It's found in the book. We must be diligent students and doers of the word. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we ask that you would strengthen us to do and be the things that we've been reminded and exhorted of from your word. We ask that we would do these things to your praise and your honor. We ask this in the name of your Son. Amen.